Hey, everybody. Hope everybody had a great Easter. And let me tell you, I've been out there working. And so the past few months, we've been talking a lot about the slowdown in the real estate industry, having to do with a lot of things. The interest rates is primary among them, and just all the different financial balls we have in the air in this country right now. But I'll tell you, it is out there, and spring has definitely caught up to us here. Here in California, it's been raining for about 3 months, it seems. And so right now, what I'm seeing is there's a pent up demand for jobs. And so all these listings are coming through all at the same time. The ones that had been not being completed because of the weather, and then also just the typical spring selling. So I don't want to make this about that, but just to tell you why I haven't been on in a while, because I've been out there working. And it seems anyway, from where I am here in the Bay Area of California, that the high-end listings have been really popping. So I've been shooting a lot of homes lately that are $2 to $5 million or so. And that dovetails very nicely with today's subject of our discussion, and that is the Sony versus Canon thing. The two market leaders, unquestionably. And now that we are entering the meat of 2023, and indeed the NAB show is just coming up in the next few days, it'll be exciting to see what these two camera brands bring to this show. But I, for my line of work, which is real estate and interiors, have been straddling these two systems, the Sony and the Canon system, for probably most of a year. I've been a Sony shooter for a long time, and I first switched over to Sony from Nikon with the A7R3, and the only reason I bought the R3 at the time is because the A7 III, their do-everything jack-of-all-trades mirrorless body, was not at that time available. It was brand new. Everybody wanted one. I couldn't get my hands on an A7 III, but an R3 was available. So, okay, I went ahead and I bought the R3, even though it was much more expensive because I didn't know when the next time A7 III was going to be available. And you know, the A7R3, with all the cameras that I've had since then, it's probably a dozen of them or so, is really a nice, neat camera. 42 megapixel, great resolution for a modern full frame camera to have. And it and the A7 III, it is a better camera than the A7 III. You know, not a lot of people talk about that because more people have experience with the A7 III than the A7R3. The A7R3 was absolutely a better camera than the A7 III, and I think the best way that I could describe how it was better was I could more easily judge my exposure with the A7R3. So something about the EVF that was better, something about the back screen that was better. I could more easily judge my exposure with the R3. And the files were higher resolution. The files were a bit more robust as well. Wasn't as good in low light as the A7 III, but it really was a fantastic camera. So here we are coming into 2023. For the past couple years, like I said, I've gone through plenty of cameras since I had the A7R3. I think I was in like 2018, and I was coming most recently from Nikon crop bodies. I have been for the past couple years photographing the majority of my stills work with the Sony Alpha 1. It is an insanely robust beast of a camera, the A1 is. I'll bring the comments up here. And there's really not a lot that the A1 does wrong. There is a lot of chatter within the A1 community about how people feel put out since they've spent $6,500 on the Sony flagship camera, and it does not have the feature set as some of the other lesser cameras and some of the other newer cameras. I really don't have a problem with that because Sony in the A1 has given us what could be the world's most perfect stills camera. The sensor is just beautiful. I mean, it's a 50 megapixel sensor. So this is the same sensor. It's rumored this is the same sensor that's in the Venice Mark II that just got released over the past, year or so. Is the same as the Sony A1 stills sensor, a 50 megapixel stacked sensor. And it's a beast of a sensor. It's a beast of a camera. The CFX Type A architecture, the focusing system, the robustness of the files, and that's something we're going to talk about here today. And that's one of the reasons why I'm between Sony and Canon still in 2023. So I've shot the A1 for a couple of years as my primary camera. A7R5 came out. I wasn't going to get one, but I found myself in a position where the latest A1 firmware update, either that or the latest update of the Sony Imaging Edge native control app for that camera, which we'll also talk about later because it's changing to something that I don't think is as good, and it all weighs into this Sony versus Canon thing. My A1 became unstable to use on the daily. I couldn't trust it anymore, so I was out shooting interiors and wirelessly tethered to my iPad, and the A1 would lose connection often, especially, now I troubleshot this, especially when I am also firing a strobe wirelessly with the flash trigger on the shoe. The iPad would lose connection to the A1. I still don't know whether it was the camera body that was losing connection, whether it was the iPad wirelessly tethering via the Sony Imaging Edge control app, whether it was the flash trigger on top of the camera. I don't know what about that was being unstable. However, when I switched out the A1 to the A7 IV, the A7 IV was stable in that whole ecosystem that the A1 all of a sudden was not stable in anymore. And my workflow is one that it needs to be a workflow. This is my busy season. I can't afford to be chasing bugs all the time. I just need to nose to the grindstone. When I go and shoot a property, I need everything to work the way that I'm used to, my workflow is working, or I need to figure out a workflow that's different or better. So the A1 became unstable with, like I said, either its recent firmware update or the Imaging Edge update. So I still had need for a high resolution body. I had been also shooting the R5C here for video, and we'll talk about that, the R5C for video versus the Sony options. And as a stand-in, I started using the R5C as a stills option. The Canon Connect app is not as good as the Sony Imaging Edge app. And anybody who tells you different is just jiving you. It's not as good. The Sony app is so much better in so many ways. It has a real resolution on the preview, whereas the Canon Connect app was built originally for a phone, and therefore the resolution does not translate when you blow it up to an iPad. Everything looks soft, and that's a tough way to work when everything looks soft. You have to use the focus assist tool within the Canon camera to know that what you are trying to focus on is actually in focus. So, and it's not as fast as the Sony app. By way of the biggest and most egregious part of this is you cannot modify your settings when you're wirelessly tethering with the Canon app, as the frame that you just took is still transmitting over to your iPad to preview it. Whereas with the Sony app, with the Imaging Edge app, you can still. You can fire your frame, adjust your values, fire your frame, adjust your values. And so when you're doing things like compositing stills, it's a much more usable app than the Canon app. Aside from all of that, with the Sony app, you can adjust pretty much everything about the camera, including the mode that the camera is in, that you would otherwise be adjusting with the mode dial. You can adjust the focusing, whether it be manual or AF, the focusing point, the white balance, everything, right? Including, along with all of your gross exposure adjustments with it. So it's just a better app, the Imaging Edge, than the Canon Connect app. And like I said, in a lot of ways. But A1 was unstable. A7 IV was stable. I have shot recently luxury listings. Like I said, I've been getting a lot of homes lately between like $2 and $5 million with the R5C. And here's one of the big reasons why the R5C and any Canon camera, and there's been several of them that I have tried recently, is not as good for what I do as any Sony camera that I've tried recently. And this is the most recent ones are the A1, the A7 IV, and this is now the A7 R5 that I picked up when my A1 became unstable with my tethering. Biggest reason is the files are not as robust. The stills files coming out of the Canon cameras are not as robust. Now, you can see this somewhat depicted even just in the file sizes. At first, I thought, well, if the Canon R5 and the R5C are 45 megapixel and the A1 is 50 megapixel, then the files ought to be relatively sized to each other, but they're not. The Sony is about twice as heavy. Okay, so for a 50 megapixel Sony file coming out of the Alpha 1, it's about 100 megabytes. So it's about 2 megabytes per megapixel of resolution. However, with the Canon R5 variant cameras, so the R5, which I've had one of, and the R5C, which I do have one of, that same raw file, uncompressed raw file, is only about 1 megabyte per megapixel. So at first I thought, well, maybe it's just the codec is more efficient, right? Getting the same resolution, but since the codec is more efficient, they're lighter files, and that's great. I mean, that if that were true, that would be an absolute benefit, especially if you're doing what I'm doing, which is transmitting files over to editors and getting them back and such. But when you start to edit with the raw files coming out of the R5 and coming out of versus any other Sony camera, and the A1 is the best at this, by the way, what you'll find is, especially when it comes to latitude in the highlights, and especially when it comes to those highlights containing or you putting in or removing saturation within them. So I'm talking about skies really specifically. There will be times where I will see a sky through a window. Now, I'm a real estate photographer, so I'm trying to capture enormous amounts of dynamic range. So I do bracketing, I do flash ambient and all that kind of stuff, but there's going to be times where I want that sky I need a little bit of the heat out of that sky. There is just a higher threshold between, what the point of no return is with the Sony cameras. And you can set the zebras at the values that you can. Well, that's the other thing with Sony cameras. You can set zebras, but the Canon cameras in stills mode, you can't. I have no idea why. You can in video, but not in stills. But right there at that threshold, okay, you can recover information, especially chroma information. And so you can get the blue back out of that sky with the Sony cameras and the Sony files. You cannot with the Canons. And that might be where the twice as heavy Sony files really shine, is you actually do have more information to play with in the Sony files than you do in the Canon files. So if that's true, which I believe it is, because like I said, I've been up in the air with both of these systems for at least a year now, and I've shot Sony cameras for several years before that. I am very familiar with all of these cameras now. And it is absolutely true that Sony files from most Sony cameras are more robust. I'm talking about image files now, we'll get into video, are more robust than the Canon files. And it's also absolutely true that the Sonys are faster working cameras. The app is more robust, the app is more functional. The focusing system on the newer Sony cameras is better than anything that I've tried out of Canon. Now, I have not tried the R6 Mark II, nor have I tried the R3. Okay, so the R3 allegedly has the same kind of focusing system as the R5C that I do have, has in it, the DPA F2, whatever. They're all tuned a little bit differently, right? R6 Mark II, I think, is supposed to be better than everything. I don't think Canon will say that because they don't want to kill the R3 sales, but I think the R6 Mark II is supposed to be better focusing even than the R3. But I digress, okay? That's only one thing. The files are more robust. Even on the A7 IV, the files are more robust. So I went ahead and I bought the A7 R5 for those of you joining us, hey, Mike Ransom, how you doing? R3 is the stack sensor, and so is the A1, but I don't know if that has anything to do, Mike, with the focusing system, So the R3 is absolutely a fantastic camera, and it has, hey, how you doing? And it has tempted me a few times before. The R3 has. I just don't know if for a flagship camera, and that's what Canon calls it right now. They say that the R3 and the the DSLR, the 1DX3 they're up to now, are co-flagships within Canon land. But they're only like, 24 megapixel, 26 megapixel. I do actually need more resolution than that. I can get away with the 33 megapixel A7 IV, but I can still tell a difference between the R5C, which is 45 megapixel, the A1, which is 50 megapixel, and now I also have the A7 R5, which is 61 megapixel, and I've had the A7 R4 too, so I'm already familiar with that, that sensor. There's a difference, there really is, and especially so in the course of my work, right, in real estate photography, so this is my heaviest crops are usually this. It is the outside shot of the front elevation of the home. Now, that is a shot that a lot of real estate agents like to use as their quote-unquote hero shot. I wouldn't really call it a hero shot, but they like it to be the lead shot. In my opinion, that's not always the best thing, but that's what they like. Let's see here. 45, not too much, not too. I agree with you, bud. Absolutely. So 45 megapixel is in my opinion, most perfect full frame resolution. Too much under that, you lose the ability to crop heavily. Too much over that, and that is one of the problems that the 61 megapixel A7R5 has. It's noisy. It's noisy because the pixel pitch is very dense on the sensor, and there's all kinds of other problems associated with it then. But about cropping, okay, when I crop the heaviest is typically when I am shooting the front elevation of a home and I'm standing on the ground, especially like a 2-story home, which could go up, about 15 feet or so, 20 feet. I want to maximize the home, faux myself some elevation, and get rid of a lot of the foreground in front of me. The obvious question then, for those who are not really used to shooting real estate photography, is why don't you shoot wider? You shoot wider, you can get up front. Well, you can do that, but what happens when you shoot wider is perspective distortion. All right, and so it starts looking all funhousey. And so my preferred method to get a good clean elevation shot that is very put together is to stand across the street and with, say, like a 16 to 35, zoom into 35 millimeter. Okay, so I have a nice, clean, relatively perspective distortion-free depiction of the structure in front of me across the street. I'm zoomed into 35 millimeter, make sure my verticals, my horizontals, everything is copacetic. What I'm still going to have then, especially since I'm now standing across the street, is I'm going to have an ocean of street in the bottom of my frame. Because I'm obviously a lot closer to the street than I am the top of the house since I stopped growing at 5'8", right? So this is where high resolution bodies with real estate work really come in handy, is I can take and crop from the bottom, crop up a lot of that street, right? Which gives me some faux elevation on the front of the home. I'm already minimizing perspective distortion since I'm far away and I'm zooming into 35 millimeters. And on these higher resolution bodies, once I do that, even if I crop heavily, I still have a good amount of resolution and a very sharp image. So when you have a flagship camera that Canon says is a flagship, which is like 26 megapixel or whatever it is, that does limit that kind of technique. And there are those who would say, but wait a second, we're talking about real estate anyway. The MLS compresses the images down to whatever, 3 megabytes or whatever it is anyway. That's true, but in the case of the homes that I've been shooting recently and that are in my market, these are millions of dollars, plural. And when you have firms that are marketing those homes, and when you have luxury builders who are building those homes, their marketing is much more robust than, say, like the you, me, everybody tract home in flyover country. Let's see. Greg Witten, how you doing, bud? I've stood on top of my car for some of those front elevation shots before to solve that problem. Yeah, I actually have, I have a Sprinter van with a ladder on the back, and I've done the same. I've stood on, actually it's a 4-wheel drive Sprinter van, which means from the factory it's a little bit taller anyway than your standard one, and so the load floor in it is probably about 3.5 feet or so high off of the ground. And so that actually works sometimes, is I can park the van where I want to, stand inside the van so I don't have to climb the ladder and get myself some elevation like that. But I have got on top of the roof of the van before too. One time in particular, I remember, I've only done it a handful of times, but one time in particular was, sometimes you get houses where if you live somewhere with hills, the house will be facing, the front of the house will be facing out, the view, will be right there. And so you got to try to figure out how to shoot the front of the house without putting a drone up there and having it be a lesser quality drone image. So, okay. Mike, not sure any tilt shift RF lenses yet. They're rumored to be coming, Mike. That's one of the things that Canon has been floating. So the 14 millimeter tilt shift and a 24. It should be 24 if it isn't. 24 makes the most sense. That's the one that, that's the only tilt shift lens that I have. I've had the 17 before also, EF tilt shifts, but I have the 24. I still use it mostly for twilights, for that same, kind of thing that we're talking about, to give myself some elevation. The tilt shift lenses are just not, they're not very copacetic to workflows. They're slow. They're slow lenses. They're manual lenses. And that's one of the things that allegedly is rumored, is that when Canon unveils the RF tilt shift lenses, they're going to have autofocus. I'm not exactly sure if that's, I mean, if a tilt shift lens had autofocus, I don't think it would make much difference to me. And I don't use the tilt shift lenses really much at all because, well, for two reasons. One is because I have high resolution cameras, which is what we're talking about right now. And so I have the resolution to be able to play with to crop in, crop out the street like I was talking about. And secondly, it is too easy to correct perspective with all the digital tools nowadays. Tilt shift lenses are really from a time where you couldn't do that. And you couldn't using Lightroom and, automatically adjust, my verticals, or, you can draw the guidelines and snap to it. And yeah, you'll lose a little bit of resolution, but see, it all comes down to resolution, and that's why I don't think that Canon's 26 megapixel sensor or whatever it is can be considered a flagship. I just don't. So yeah, tilt shifts and Greg, like what you were saying, I've stood on top of my car, to get stood on top of the van, rather to get that elevation before, but it's AI. So it's AI what? AI is gonna take an elevation shot of the house for me. It's funny. I should do like a whole talk about AI because there's been some interesting discussions around AI lately, right? And the as real estate photographers especially, and I'm getting kind of off track from where I was going with the Canon versus Sony thing here, but as real estate photographers specifically, I'm not worried about AI. And the reason I'm not worried about AI is because what I am doing is more than manipulating information, which is what AI does. I'm capturing information, right? I'm going there. AI is not going to know what's inside that house unless it has seen it or whatever, right? Now, will there be a time where your Amazon Echo Alexa dot thing or whatever is not only going to be listening to you all the time, but it's also going to be watching you? And because you have these connected devices in every single room, it's going to know what every single room is, and it's going to spit out some real estate photos for you. I don't know, maybe, but you know what? I'm in my 40s, and I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen before I decide to retire. So it's going to be someone else's problem. Other than that, I think AI is fantastic. I mean, I'm really excited about, and my gears have been turning, for the past, especially year or so. When all these things like the ChatGPT and the, all the AI art and such that right now is giving people like 8 fingers on one hand, and but it's getting better. Like every single, I can't think of the name of that software that's doing that kind of stuff. So there's a couple of them. Unreal Engine, I think, is one of them, and I can't think of but anyway, it's getting better and it's very creative. And here's the other thing about AI. Okay, like I said, we are there capturing information for AI to use, or for us to use in creative ways with AI. So it's not so much that AI has any. Our jobs are not threatened right now by AI as real estate photographers. Absolutely not. Because like I said, it doesn't have the information. We have to be there and capture the information. However, our pay might be a little bit threatened because at what point does something, at what point is something developed that can edit a flash ambient composite interiors image as good as I can edit a flash ambient composite interiors image? And that absolutely can be developed. Are you kidding me with the type of AI and machine learning and everything nowadays? It's just a matter of time before somebody, probably from Apple, figures out how to do it. Our cell phone's going to get there. Our cell phone's going to get to the point where somebody's going to develop a real estate photography app where with your cell phone, you can scan your whole house and actually collect that information. And now with this app that you just bought for $10, it'll spit you out a set of real estate images. I don't know. Maybe. I think if anybody figured out how to do that, they'd make a fortune, and they'd piss a lot of people off, you know. But AI, I think, is going to do a lot of that anyway. So let me continue though. My Sony versus Canon. So my A1 became unstable on the control app. I bought then the A7R5 because I have I have decided that the Canon in the R5C form anyway is not robust. The files are not robust enough to be pushing and pulling luminance values at the fringes and chroma values within those high luminances. Not so much the shadows. The shadows are actually very good on the Canon cameras, better than the Sony shadows. But I'm working so often with highlights, shooting real estate, having sky, nuclear light blowing in through windows. That's the wheelhouse that I'm working in. And the Sonys are just way better at that. Even the A7 IV, which is, you know, a fraction of the cost of some of these other cameras that we're talking about. It's half as much as the R5C. It's a third as much as the R3, right? Or whatever it is now. Yeah, Mike, so Sony sensor dynamic range. It's, you know, I'm not really, whenever people are talking about dynamic range, I don't really think that Sony cameras have appreciably more dynamic range than the Canon cameras, but I think they're set up to capture that dynamic range differently. And I think the log curves within the video profiles, and I think you know, the log curves within, like, you know, how the Adobe suite is interpreting the raw image capture and everything with the stills capabilities are make the highlights more loggier, like less linear, right? More logarithmic. And so that point of no return, it eases up into that point of no return, whereas the Canon highlights are very clippy. And once they're gone, they're gone. And so, and that's absolutely true with the, you know, with the R5 type of cameras. LiDAR scan, yeah. So LiDAR is, so that's something that the iPhones already do. Or is it the iPhones that do it now? Yeah, I think the 14 does LiDAR now too. I'm telling you, it's all there. Like the hardware's all there to be able to do it. You know, it's just somebody figuring out how to make a set of real estate images out of it. Because like Matterport, I don't have my Matterport camera around here, but Matterport does something real similar, right? And anybody who's worked with an actual Matterport camera, like a Pro 2, or now there's the Pro 3. I haven't worked with that one yet, but I've got a couple of the Pro 2s. It's a very nice camera. I mean, it is high resolution. And I actually have delivered images off of that camera that the untrained eye would swear it's a flash ambient composite, even though it's an in-camera HDR. But there's such a high resolution with those cameras, and the software is so good at compositing that together that with a little bit of tweaking in post, you can BS somebody into thinking that's a... So Matterport's really a good, you know, a good thing to point to as far as like, you know, can you with LiDAR and with your iPhone spin it around? I mean, you know, you need some sense of it. I mean, here's the thing that the average person isn't going to be able to do. They're not going to know how to frame up a shot. You know, they're not going to know what makes a shot look good. The app could maybe guide them and say, well, make sure you're level on the vertical, make sure you're level on the horizontal, you know, and I think people are getting more used to those types of things just with the prevalence of gimbals nowadays, and how gimbals have a tilt axis, a roll axis, you know, a pan axis. And so they're starting to familiarize yourself with what a vertical does. You know, like if I take a camera and do this, they now are starting to familiarize themselves with, okay, now it's going to look like that if I do that. And if I make it level, it's like that. If I go down, it looks like, you know. And so I think people are starting to kind of get that, but nobody has yet to put it together into something that will tell somebody where to put a camera or do it itself off of the LiDAR measurements or whatever. And if they do, I don't know, maybe we're out of job. So bought the A7R5 because I needed a high resolution body. Like I said, I've been shooting a lot of, you know, big bougie houses lately. I had the A7R4 for a couple of years. I used it as my main camera before I got the A1. And A7R4 was a fantastic sensor, but the camera was awful. You know, the camera was just such a bear to use. Everything was slow. Everything was buggy. You know, it wasn't very stable. It's like the worst kind of slow too. It's the kind of slow where if there were images in the buffer that have yet to clear because it's 61 megapixel images, that 61 megapixel uncompressed raw is like 120, 130 megabytes. And it was writing them to SD cards because that's before the Sonys went to the CF Express A cards. And so it took a while for that buffer to clear. And the camera was like absolutely locked up while the buffer was writing, right? You couldn't make any adjustments or anything. You couldn't fire another. It's just you know, like I think you could fire another frame, but you couldn't adjust any of your values, you know. And so it was so difficult to work with just because of that. The A7R5 fixes effectively what was wrong with the A7R4, but I think Sony didn't go far enough. Okay, so what the A7R4 was a beautiful sensor that was wrapped up in a camera that was not fast enough for that sensor. Now what the A7R5 is, it's the opposite. See, we have tasted what the A1 can do. And the A7R4 sensor now, which is in the A7R5, is no A1 sensor. Sure, it's got a little bit more resolution. But now what we're left with is, whereas the A7R4 was a 61 megapixel camera that was like the best of the best, now the A1 just throttles that sensor. You know, I mean, it's faster. It's got better noise performance. The A1 files are more robust than the A7R5 files. The A1, the camera itself, is more consistent. And by that, I mean, it's more consistent the way that a big deal is made about this and the autofocus, right, with the chip and this and that. Okay, and that might be true or not. If you're photographing people, I'm not photographing people. So for what I am using it for, and that is tracking of static objects, right? So like focus recomposing kind of stuff. Adjusting my depth of field, putting a tracking box on something, recomposing, does that tracking box stick, you know, or does it go? The A1 is better at that than the A7R5 is. So what this is now is this is a really good camera like the A1 is. It functions just like an A1. It's fast. It's got dual CF Express cards. Some parts of it are better, like this screen that does this, right? That is absolutely better than the A1's junk back screen. This screen is awesome, by the way, and I hope that finds their way into all Sony cameras. But what you have now is a new camera with an old sensor. Before you had a new sensor with an old camera. And I think Sony could have done that a little bit better. I think instead of using the A7R4 parts bin sensor, they could have, and I absolutely agree with you, Mike, the A7R3 42 megapixel. That was a real standout. Okay, Greg, I've been using the Canon EOS RP with 24 megapixels and it's been just fine with bracketing. Looking at getting a Sony eventually because Canon's business practices regarding third-party lenses. I made a video about that. I'm so conflicted about that whole thing because as a photographer and as a photographer who has a body of work out there now, I do have copyright infringements that I have to deal with people. In fact, here in Sonoma County on the 116 out in Sebastopol, there is a little barbecue restaurant that if you were to go to their website, their landing page right now is my photograph of that building. And they were not my client, right? So they are using that photograph and I just don't want to go down the road to have them try to sue them for it. But But that happens, when you're out there and you get a body of work, and it's really it has a lot to do with the social media age that we're in, where people just in general think that photography is free, and and that's not exactly how, especially United States copyright law works. Like, I could go after that little barbecue restaurant for using my photograph. So the way that they got it anyway is because I was hired by the agent who was selling the building. So this restaurant is leasing the space from the owner of the building. So they're not my client. No money changed hands, yet it's my photograph that they are using to market their business, right? So as far as Canon locking down their lens mounts, I get it in that sense. I get it. I'm a photographer and I have work stolen from me since I'm a photographer. And again, this likely isn't going to happen if you're somebody just starting out, but if you have a big body of work out there, it happens. It happens especially when you're photographing like the places I'm talking about, these big multi-million-dollar things. You can take a shot of a kitchen in a multi-million-dollar house, and there is commercial value there for the maker of the range, the maker of the cabinetry, the guy who did the custom drapes. There's commercial value there in those things, and you get stuff lifted off of you. When you do that, if you're not careful. And there's whole search engines now where you could like search, you could search the internet for your work, and it'll show you where all the violations are. So I get Canon locking down their lens mount because that is their intellectual property, right? They developed the RF mount. They spent bazillions of dollars making it and marketing it and such. And here people are saying, okay, with Viltrox specifically, they were kind of, reverse engineering it and making lenses. So I get that Canon did that. However, I do also understand it's a bit tone deaf, especially when you have Canon's competitors like Sony that's out there, opened up their mount to Tamron, opened up their mount to Sigma and such. It is what it is, man. Like, I am blessed enough, and these are all business expenses for me. I use these tools to make money. Everything that I have has paid itself off plenty of times over. I can afford the first party glass. That's not everybody's situation though. I get it. I absolutely do. And the Canon lenses are expensive. I have A7R4, too many pixels for everyday use for me. You know what? That's kind of what I'm finding out with the A7R5. Same sensor, right? 61 megapixels is just, I agree. It's just too much. It's too much. And I think, Mike, it's you that said that the 40, oh yeah, here it is right here, this comment of yours. 42 megapixels, A7R3 40. A7R3 is such a great camera. It really is. That's the one that when I switched over from Nikon crop bodies into the Sony system, it was to the A7R3. I still love that camera. I haven't had it for a while. I haven't had it for a few years now. Yeah, because I think I went from the A7R3 to the A7R4 to the A1 to now I'm trying to decide whether I want to stay with the A1 or not. I actually have my A1 right now. I'd sent it in somewhere so they can give me a bid on it to buy it from me. Probably for around 3,000 or so, which, you know what? Yeah, that might be leaving a little bit of money on the table if I were to like try to do like the Craigslist dude thing myself or whatever. But that A1 in the couple years I've had it, it's paid for itself dozens of times. So, if I can, it's a well-run camera. If I can get half my money back out of it, and move on with my life, that might be a thing. But I agree, man. 42 megapixels. It's really that 45, like the R5C here, the 45 megapixel resolution for full frame is great resolution. It really is. And I wish all cameras were that. I think third-party lenses will be coming eventually. I think so too. I think Canon was just going after the people who were the most egregious violators of their patent. And Nikon's done the same thing. They're going after the most egregious violators of their patents. Sony, I think Sony's take on it is a little bit different. It's kind of like Tesla, right? So maybe, gosh, it has to have been close to 10 years ago now. There was Elon Musk, who always makes big news anytime he does anything anyway, right? He was in the news because he opened up Tesla's patents really for anybody. And at first you think, well, okay, well, that's crazy, because you've got these other giant auto manufacturers that are now going to bury you, now that they know how you're doing what you're doing. But Elon Musk, his response to that line of thinking was, but look, if we don't get the world to adopt this technology, we're not going to survive, and so by opening up this intellectual property across the industry, that is going to help us as well. That's a bold move. And, if you had bought stock in Tesla then and you've held it till now, you can see that it's worked. I think that might be what Sony's doing with their lens mount, right? Is they are allowing all of these companies to produce cheap lenses in Asia. The Japanese lenses are Asia. In the not as Japanese part of Asia, the ones that are building the plastic toys and stuff, to sell more cameras and to get people into the ecosystem. And Sony rightly understands that ecosystems are a lot of money. You're going to spend a lot more money on lenses than you will on bodies. And so if they get people to buy the lenses, they know that those people are stuck in that ecosystem. They're going to keep on having to buy the bodies, and they cannot buy those from Tamron or from Sigma. So I think that's that's the disconnect there. Canon might be willing to work with third parties if they pay a license. Yeah, and that's fine. And I think they should pay a license. Canon's spent a lot of money developing a lens mount. It's not easy doing those types of things. So the only one that I've ever seen successfully reverse engineer that mount in its entirely is Red. And what's interesting about that is, okay, Red reverse engineered that mount into the Komodo. And I didn't buy a Komodo at first. I did end up buying a Komodo, but I didn't buy a Komodo at first because one of the things that Red was always saying is it was going to have autofocus. And for a while there, they couldn't get that to work. They did, because they had to try to figure out all of Canon's protocols with their pins and all that, and so it's like, I was kind of on the fence, like, if I buy a Red Komodo, it's going to be that it's a manual camera. And then if autofocus comes, which it did, and it works pretty well, actually, if autofocus comes, then, hey, it's a bonus. And so that's why I ended up buying a Red Komodo when I did. And it was around the same time that the autofocus update came out anyway. But yeah, working with third parties that pay a license, why not? And it's within their best interest, them being Tamron and Sigma and such, to pay that license and do it, if they want to sell lenses, absolutely. I also think motors in the new Sony lenses are superior to Canon's. I don't know. I have more new Canon lenses than I do new Sony lenses. And I think that's just because I've been in the Sony ecosystem for longer. And so, for instance, like I've got the 70-200 GM version 1, right? Now, the 70-200 GM version 2 is allegedly a much better lens than the version. I mean, it should be, right? It's newer. But I don't use the one that I have. I'm not a sports photographer, right? So the maybe once per month or so, if that I use my 70-200 isn't worth the squeeze for me to sell it and get a new one with the newer motors in it. And so I wouldn't know. I've got a few 50 millimeters. The fastest one I have is the 1.4 planar, the Sony Zeiss 1.4 planar. Now you've got the 1.2 GM, the 1.4 GM. I've got the little 55, 1.8, and I've got the 1.4 planar. I think like one other two, but I don't have either GMs. I wasn't very attracted to the GM ones when they came out because they breathed as much as they do, and that's before I think that all the cameras did the focus breathing compensation. But I like the planar, So because my Sony kit or my experience with Sony is a few years older than my experience with Canon, that's a more recent addition for me. The Canon lenses I have are newer than the Sony lenses I have. And I will say this, the Canon, I think the Canon RF lenses, I do like them over the Sony lenses for a couple of reasons. I think they're sharper. I think the coatings are a little bit more flare resistant than the Sony lenses in general. And it behaves differently. Like it behaves differently with dust on the front element than it does sunlight just beaming through and so forth. But I think optically, the RF lenses are a little bit better. But the thing that I really like about the RF lenses is how so many of them are stabilized. That's really a big thing, especially with like the R5C, which has a pinned sensor in it. It doesn't have any sensor stabilization, and that's good because Canon sensor stabilization is not very good. It's got the wobbles, right? You have not RF. My 135 is quick focusing. Your EF 135 is yeah. I've never had that lens. So GM. Yeah, the GM lenses are, I mean, not all of them. I recently sold it because I didn't use it too much. The 85 GM, which there isn't a new version of yet, and it is not very fast. I mean, it's got big heavy elements. It's noisy. The planar is noisy too. Um, so it's just like anything, man. The new lenses are faster, better. So, that's slow. Yeah, the 85 GM, it is. It's a slow lens. But yeah, so for my purposes, like this, which one do I have on here right now? I think this is the 1535. Oh no, it's the 24105. This one too. The Canon 24105 RF and the 1535, which on the Canon bodies is kind of my workhorse, just like the 1635 Sony GM is. Um, the 1535 Canon it's a beautiful lens. I mean, it goes that 1 millimeter wider, which does make a difference, when you're shooting really wide. 2.8 aperture throughout. It's stabilized. It's fast. It's quiet. I mean, it's really a beautiful lens, and that's kind of where I'm at with it. Is the A7 IV. I've kind of gained a new appreciation for in my trying to figure out um, where I'm going. So if I'm successful in selling the A1, I may actually return the A7R5. It's still within my return window to do so. And I just, like I said, it feels to me like whereas the A7R4 was a new sensor and an old camera, this is a new camera with an old sensor. And both of them miss, but for different reasons. There are things I love about the camera. I love that screen. The viewfinder it's not as good as the A1. I think the refresh rate on the A1s is a little bit, I don't know. A1 just seems better, somehow. The viewfinder's not as good as the A1s, but it's beautiful. It's far and away better than anything else Sony's got and anything else that I've seen that Canon has too. Um, it's like the A7S III viewfinders like that too, right? So, but let me switch gears real quick though. Let's see, old motor. Yeah, the 85 GM's old motor. That is true. Let's see if I get Canon 24105 would be my first. The Canon 24105, the RF, it is a sleeper. So I mean it is, I think, one of Canon's best lenses. It really is. And it's fast, it's sharp, even wide open at f4 it's sharp. Its maximum magnification is at the 105 millimeter end, but it close focuses enough. Like it's not a macro lens, obviously, right? But you can get some pretty nice perspectives out of that reproduction at 105 millimeters. Uh, it's quiet and it barely breathes at all. So that's something that I actually found out when I was using the R5C a lot for a stint. I don't think I had that lens when I was using the Komodo a lot, but when I was using the R5C a lot to do this kind of thing, the talking head thing, um, if it racked focus, the frame would barely move, and so that is different. Like I also have the big Chody, the 28 to 70 f2. beautiful lens, breathes like a mother, right? So if you have any camera body without the lens breathing compensation in it, the 28-70 f2, you know, if you're doing video, you just make sure it doesn't misfocus, or your frame's gonna go. So, let me switch gears a little bit because the table's actually turned when it comes to video, and that is where I really have been enjoying immensely the R5C, especially now it's got its new Netflix firmware update. I can tell a difference. I can tell a difference in the highlights, and I've seen a couple people. It's such a minor difference that the few people that I've seen that have tested it in controlled ways, even they come to different conclusions, one from the other, about what's different with it. I think I see, and I don't shoot at charts. You know, I just go out and work with. I'm too busy. You know, I just go out and work with the things and see what's up. I think I can tell the difference in the knee of the highlight roll-off with the R5C post-firmware update. Now, here's the thing that's interesting about the R5C. It has always been a camera that appears to have more dynamic range than the OG R5. And Canon will tell you that the R5 and the R5C have the same exact sensor and the same exact processor. So why then would the R5C have visible? I mean, you can see this. You know, I had the R5 and the R5C at the same time. You can absolutely see this. The R5C has more dynamic range than the R5, even though it should have, you know, the same guts in it. Now, at first I was thinking, well, it could be that the R5C has XF-ABC modes that you can, it could have to do with the codec, right? Could have to do with the R5C downscaling the 8K capture into 4K in more frame rates and codecs and such, because it does. R5 is more limited in that regard. And when you're downscaling from a high resolution capture, you also are lowering the noise floor, right? Because you're descaling that noise or raising the noise. You know what I mean? You're descaling noise, which just makes your dynamic range better because now you're getting cleaner shadows. But for whatever reason, the R5C is better than the R5 at that. For video, it is better than the A7S3 in most ways. And before everybody thinks I'm throwing shade at the A7S3, I'm not. In fact, of all the video cameras that I have ever had, it's been a pile of them, I've made the most money with the A7S3. Still have it, still use it. The R5C is better. The R5C is better. The image is better coming out of the R5C. Getting that 8K downscale of 4K. So the highest and best use of the R5C is exactly what Netflix thinks too. It's the XF-AVC 4K downscaled from the 8K capture. It is not the RAW. And I know the RAW gets all the traction and you got to power delivery to it so you can have your lens still work and so on and so forth, you know, choose up batteries. That's not the highest and best use of the R5C. The highest and best use of the R5C is C-Log 3, XF-ABC 4K, and that is downscaled from 8K. It's got the most dynamic range that way. Technically, that's true if you were to shoot RAW and then interpret it into C-Log 2 in your NLE, but it is so noisy that by the time you clean up that noise, you're going to smear around your image. You might get a little bit more latitude in the highlights. It is just not worth the squeeze doing that. And you have to work with high frame rate 8K RAW. You know, and I've got a computer here that you know, the thing dims the lights, you know, and it still struggles with that. It's not a very good codec. So this camera is better than the A7S3 though for a few key reasons. One is it's not interjecting a bunch of smeary noise reduction on the image. A7S3 absolutely always is. If you are shooting S-Log 3 on any of the Sony cameras, with the exception of the FX6, it is putting noise reduction in the image, and that's how it is getting more dynamic range. and it's pretty easy to see. It's easy to see on the A7S III. So I shoot something in S-Log3 and grade it, and then go to one of the baked-in profiles that allows you to dump the native ISO down to like 100, 200 versus the 640 base ISO on the A7S III, and it's even higher on some of the other Sony cameras. And you will see that if you grade the image to look exactly the same, the one that's baked in will look sharper, because the A7S III is always interjecting that smeary noise reduction on the image. The R5C is cleaner. Not only is it not doing that, but it is downscaling from a higher resolution capture. So the image just looks better out of the R5C. Aside from that, the R5C has real exposure tools. Now, when you are shooting, especially real estate, and you have something with a massive amount of dynamic range, the best way you can judge that exposure with the A7S III is by using the zebras, right? And so you know that I think I've got my zebras on the A7S III to 92. I think they're at 92. And so the way that I judge that is, if let's say it's a sunny day, there are clouds outside. If my clouds have zebras on them and my blue sky does not, that's the most dynamic range I'm going to get out of the A7S III, right? At the 92 IRE zebra value, I think is what it is. It's been a while since I've set it up. The R5C does not have the highlight latitude that the A7S III, but what it does have is a waveform. And it has a waveform that actually has a couple different ways that you can set it up, so you can define on your waveform whatever is in your focus box to be a different color, so it's red versus green. And especially when you're outside and you're working with NDs on it, to be able to raise and lower the ND and see where your waveform on the highlights and on the shadows actually is such a faster way to work and a better way to work, because I know that when I'm outside and when I deliver my videos, I like the peak luminance of the sky to be a little bit over 80 IRE. I find that that's just kind of where I like to be. When you have a waveform like this that's up all the time, like with an R5C type of camera, it is so much easier to do that than to just based on your zebras, which come and go depending on how you set them. There's only so many different values you can set zebras to, right? So the waveform is absolutely clutch on the R5C. Shutter angle is great. If I want to change frame rate, I don't have to mess with trying to figure out shutter. It's awesome, So I mean, there are, and I do, and okay. And the third thing is, I do like the colors. I like the look of the camera, and yes, it does matter. Yes, even for people who know how to grade, it matters. I know how to grade just fine, But I'd like to. Something that Cam Mackey said, right? Camera sensors are like film stocks, and so they all look different. And so regardless of if you know how to grade or how well you know how to grade, if you point a red Komodo at something and you point a Pocket 6K at that same thing and you point a Sony A1 at it, all three of them are going to look different even after you grade it. They just do. In that regard, I like the Canon R5C sensor better than the Sony whatever, and all the Sonys I've tried, as far as the look of the sensor with shooting video. I like the Canon R5C better than I do the Sony sensors. Sony sensors hold highlights better. Absolutely true. They've got a softer approach to that white point. Absolutely true. They're more recoverable. No doubt about it. The Canons are sharper, and I like the colors better. And to me, along with the exposure tools that I now get in the R5C-like waveform, makes me want to stick with the R5C for that specific use case for video. For photo, the Canons for me just aren't the right fit, because again, the Sonys have a more robust file. The Sonys have a better tethering control. The Sonys have better focusing system. Little things even, like with the Canon, the built-in level in there is backwards from what the Sony is. And so it's not like Goofy Foot, right? Like I like Goofy Foot levels, and so if I go up, then it goes down. It's kind of more like a joystick flying a plane, right? The Canon is like regular foot. Like if I go up, the level goes up, and it's like it messes with me, you know. And I've had a while to get used to it, and it still messes with me. So for me, that's that. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and sign off. Hour and 6 minutes. Thanks, Mike, for playing along here, and a few others of you. Greg, thanks for playing along too, Greg. I know this was kind of a impromptu live stream, but yeah, that's where I am with Sony and Canon in 2023, and I don't know whether anything exciting is going to be unveiled at NAB this next week. And I'm going to see if I'm probably going to dump the A1. I've spent a lot of time singing praises about the A1. Still love it. 1/400th of a second maximum flash sync is huge on the A1, but my A1 for whatever reason has just become unstable. As far as I mean, everything about the camera's stable. As far as like just the wireless app, control app, and I don't think it's the camera's fault is really the thing here. I think it's something having to do with the firmware Sony pushed or the firmware Sony pushed on the Imaging Edge app. And now there's a new app that I'm going to make a video probably about that because you need more strokes to get to the same things on the new app. And that's not good. Sony didn't consult me first. I would have told them not to do that. You know, you're going to kill my workflow. So I'm still in limbo, man. I like the Canons for video. Totally do. I'm shooting on a Canon on a C200 right now. I got the R5C. I love the Canons for video. Canon makes better video cameras than Sony does. Fight me in the comments. I don't care. It's true. As far as stills work, the Sony cameras are way better for what I do. So I'm still in limbo. I've got E mount glass. I've got RF mount glass. I've got EF mount glass. You know, it's just coming out my ears. I would love to consolidate to one system. I would like that system to be Canon because I think that it would take Canon less work to get up to Sony's level on the stills than it would Sony to get to Canon's level on the video, I think. And that's why, you know. But anyway, thanks for playing along, and I'll see you guys soon. Peace.